with them and set out the key messages they wish to convey. Now, the original instructions were for 10 minutes each, and I think in the interests of getting the debate going on this final session, they have all agreed, and they will be very strictly kept to 5 minutes rather than 10 minutes. And if there are further points they wish to make, as I'm sure they will do so in response to questions from the audience and challenges from the panel. So therefore, we will have ample time for questions. However, I will make it clear that it should be questions as distinct from statements, and they need to be brief and to the subject and to the point. So therefore, we will have, interspersed by a break, we will have enough time to entertain as many questions as we can. I won't be asking all panelists to respond to each question, one or two panelists, and if you wish to direct a specific question to a specific panelist, please do so. So the title is Towards a Shared Understanding on Internet Freedom, number 3, New Media, Social Media and Social Networks. And in my view, we can look at a number of areas. Let's look at social media as an organizing principle. Is it an emancipatory, democratizing tool, or is it a tool for any form of clawback from power? Let's look at data protection issues, privacy issues, anonymity issues, and the right to be forgotten. Let's look at it from the question of possibly taste restraint education on behalf of people who do use frequently social networking sites. Let's look at citizen journalism. Let's look at its reliability and verification procedures. And then questions of convergence of social media alongside the more established online media trends over the last 10, 15, 20 years, and also traditional non-digital media as well. That's not an exhaustive list, and panelists and audience members can, as long as it relates to social media and social networks, discuss other questions as well. So our first speaker is Dr. Ian Brown. He's a senior research fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute. He's associate director of the Oxford University Cyber Security Centre, and he was co-author of the GNI's report last week on free expression and security. Ian.
Thanks, John. So just very briefly, I just want to make a couple of remarks related, first of all, to states and their activities in cyberspace, particularly related to privacy, building on some of the points that we make in the report, which John mentioned, which is called Digital Freedoms in International Law. If you want to search for that, it's available online. And secondly, just very briefly, I'll say a little bit about the positive obligations that states have to protect privacy, including between non-state actors, so including privacy regulation of companies, not just the activities of the states themselves. So, as several of the speakers said yesterday, of course, traditional human rights law and commitments of states apply online just as much as they do offline. The United Nations has its International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. 167 states are parties to that treaty. Through that treaty, they make a broad range of commitments, including to protect freedom of expression and privacy. Obviously, across those 167 states, there are varying degrees of compliance with what the covenant itself says and with how it's been interpreted by the UN Human Rights Committee and UN Special Rapporteurs, including Frank LaRue, who was here yesterday. A number of detailed points we make in that report, which I don't want to go into now. It is available online. What I thought I would do instead to make it more concrete was to look at the UK especially and the EU and their activities relating to privacy and surveillance, because I think Physician Hill thyself remains a good dictum, and we already had a couple of people this morning mention UK legislation, which tends to be quite influential. It's not just the impact it has on the 60-plus million citizens of the UK, but often taken as a model by many other states. And in internet surveillance, actually, the UK, I would say, unfortunately, as someone that thinks privacy is a critical human right, really has taken a lead on internet surveillance. So we have Richard Allen, I think, was an MP while this bill went through Parliament. Richard did a lot to improve things, the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act. Some of the problems with that, in terms of human rights law, unlike most other states, we don't have independent judges signing the warrants that allow surveillance of communications. We have politicians doing that. Secretaries of State authorize interception. Looking at communications data, records of communications, such as who was talking to who was logged on when, and so on, we have an even lower level of oversight and authorization. We have senior police officers basically giving themselves permission to get access to this kind of data in very large volumes. So last year there were over 500,000 of these accesses by state agencies, mainly law enforcement, to these internet communications records. Also, we have very weak oversight of that. We essentially have a retired judge appointed by the Prime Minister to oversee the system, to produce an annual report for the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister decides which parts of it are censored and which are laid before Parliament for public debate. I should say that the EU in its areas of competence is not really much better. Those of you that know about the Data Retention Directive, which was pushed through in 2006, mainly by the UK, I must admit, which requires phone companies and internet service providers to keep detailed communications data about the activities of all of their customers, all half a billion EU citizens. This directive has run into great trouble in a number of the member states' constitutional courts. So Germany, Romania, Bulgaria's constitutional courts have all found greater or lesser, usually greater, problems with the constitutionality of this directive. And actually Ireland's High Court has referred it to the European Court of Justice to ask whether this directive is actually compatible with the EU's Charter of Fundamental Rights. Somebody this morning, I think from the UK Foreign Office, mentioned the Communications Data Bill and reassured us that it's not really changing things. It is. If you look at the text, I highly recommend an analysis by a barrister called Francis Davey. If you search for that, he explains quite nicely how it would, for example, extend these data retention requirements very broadly. It would do things like allowing the government to order manufacturers of communications equipment to install hardware or software to make interception easier. It would allow the government to require that internet service providers essentially intercept all of their customer traffic going to and from specific sites, whether that's social networks or other sites, in order to record this communications data, which can then be later accessed. So that's all I will say on the state side. So I certainly wouldn't say the UK is an exemplar of protecting privacy rights in cyberspace. More broadly, I don't think, and certainly the European legal framework does not say that privacy protection is only about the activities of states themselves. It's not just those activities I was talking about. European states, at the very least, also have a positive obligation to protect privacy. People in general, there's been a lot of very good research in behavioral economics over the last 7 or 8 years, which explains why people in general often find it quite hard to make decisions about when they will disclose personal information to whom, under which circumstances, let alone the difficulties of reading 20-page legalistic privacy policies on websites and understanding what they're giving away when they share personal data. I can say more about this in response to questions if you like, but my main point here is that the idea, which to some extent is the American approach, that all of the privacy protection you need in the private sector is transparency. So you make sure companies inform consumers what's going on, but then leave it up to the marketplace. There are good reasons why that doesn't really work very well. And actually the EU approach of much more specific rules in the Data Protection Directive, whilst not perfect, whilst legalistic, whilst quite burdensome, sometimes I think that could be fixed, and the EU is trying to do that, is a better way for states to discharge that responsibility to protect online privacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ian. Thank you for that introductory broad overview on legislation and particularly in terms of restrictive legislation on privacy. Our second speaker is Birgitte Jonsdottir, well known to many of you, a Member of Parliament in Iceland and the Chair of the Board and Chief Sponsor of the Icelandic Modern Media Initiative. Birgitte.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Good to see so many of my fellow fighters for freedom of information. So in order to explain how the Icelandic Modern Media Initiative came about, I'm just going to go a little bit back in history. So many of us are aware of that Iceland had a pretty sustainable crisis in 2008. And crisis can either be a great window for profound change for the benefit of everybody or for the suppression of everybody, like 9/11 created the opportunity for pushing through the Patriot Act in the United States. So we decided, a group of people in Iceland, to use this window of opportunity to see if we could make Iceland into safe haven of freedom of information, expression, and speech in our world, with a specific focus on the fact that nearly nowhere in the world has there been an upgrade, in particularly on freedom of expression laws, to the reality of the 21st century, where information doesn't have any jurisdiction. And we were inspired by John Perry Barlow, who is one of the founders of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He visited Iceland just in the wake of the financial collapse and was speaking at the Digital Freedom Society, and he expressed this idea of Iceland could become Switzerland of bits. Just like if you want to, for example, create a tax haven, what you would do is you would look at all the best laws in the world in order to create secrecy. So why not look at all the best laws in the world that exist and function in order to create transparency? And so we went on a scouting mission to look at where are the best functioning laws, not necessarily, there are very many beautiful laws that just simply are not implemented, for example, in Georgia. They have very good laws, but they are not really implementing them. So we had a good assistance from, we actually crowdsourced this, the parliamentary resolution with people from all over the world, some British journalists, people from WikiLeaks, and people from the Pirate Party at the European Parliament, and some Icelandic experts, such as Smári McCarthy, who is here today. And we found that no one country had all the laws in one place. So that's the only sort of radical thing about this Icelandic standard. And we fortunately had this window in Iceland, so that even if I come from the smallest political movement in Iceland, I managed to get the entire parliament to say yes to it. It was set up as a proposal tasking the government to change 12 laws or write new laws. For example, we don't have any proper whistleblowing act. And it was laws that had to be changed in 4 different ministries. I was very surprised that the entire parliament and the government said yes, which proves to me that when you have a crisis, you have a window of opportunity for things that you could possibly not have done during non-crisis times. So the good news is that we are all heading into much more crisis, for example, in Europe. So I encourage you to use that window of opportunity. I mean, what happened, after the terrorist attacks is that a lot of the press freedom laws and laws to protect privacy online have been eroding at a very dramatic rate, and most people have not been aware of it because it's just not something that people think much about until they're faced with it. And a lot of it is very sneaky, and I'll be happy to discuss it later in Q&As, for example, how our current historical records are constantly being changed without our awareness by changes, slight changes, often radical changes in media, stories that have been posted and then changed or taken down. But I encourage you to look at the Icelandic Modern Media Initiative because it has created a standard. We are hoping that we will have at least 70% of the safe haven shield up by the end of this year. It's happening a little bit slower than I would, but it is happening. So I still have a minute? Yeah. So you can go to our website, immi.is, and the resolution is there in English and explanation on how, which laws that we're specifically targeting. And we have a new status report on where it's at. I think in general we have to absolutely really act fast, because we are to change the standards for the laws to protect our freedom of information, expression and speech. I feel that we are starting to lose too quickly these rights, and to my great delight, the EU Parliament has been very supportive of this resolution in the application process of Iceland to the EU. And I hope even if we might not join, they will still use it as a standard for all the EU countries.
Thank you very much indeed, Brigitte. Our third speaker is Gavin Sheridan, Innovation Director at Storiful, who will talk about citizen journalism, verification, and maybe, Gavin, if you could start by giving a very brief overview of what Storiful has been doing.
Thanks, John. So good afternoon, everyone. Storiful is a company based here in Dublin that started 2 years ago. And we consider ourselves, I suppose, a news agency for the digital age. So we started out with the premise that how many videos are being uploaded to YouTube, how many tweets are being tweeted, how many Facebook posts, and how will newsrooms in the future manage this flow of information. We started out back at the end of 2010, and it was just as the Arab Spring was starting that we realized that there was a kind of a deficit, I think, within news and within journalism to manage all of this information. So, you know, you're watching a YouTube video appear, and you have very little context about what that video means. And you might be aware of an event happening, but how does journalism and how does news deal with that new type of information? How do you check the veracity of that information? How do you contextualize it? And then how, in turn, do you make sure that the right people see it? So we work with some large news organizations around the world, ABC News. We work with YouTube itself. We just recently launched a channel called youtube.com/human rights, where we curate or bring together videos that relate to human rights abuses internationally. And we spend an awful lot of time watching videos that are uploaded every single day to YouTube that cover events internationally. We have a team of about just over 30 staff internationally, mainly based here in Dublin, but in several other countries. And we're very focused on managing what is increasingly becoming a torrent of information. I think the most recent figure is that there's 400 million tweets a day. We're trying to manage, you know, to pick out the best stuff to monitor what's going on in the world. And be able to filter and manage that is becoming increasingly difficult. So we're also working on how you build technology that helps journalists and helps newsrooms manage this new type of information. So to us, I suppose philosophically, the free flow of information is critical, obviously, to news and to journalism. So when it comes to social networks and social media particularly, the free flow of information is very important, because if somebody uploads a video to YouTube, or somebody tweets something and links to a video, or whatever the case may be, that information wants to get out, and that person wants to get that content and wants to get that information out. So to us, social networks are a critical tool in the future of where journalism is going. I would say as well that there's also fundamental new challenges that journalists have to face every day besides the information overload. There's also understanding new techniques for how you understand where a video came from. So we'd use a variety of techniques to check videos from places like Syria. It could include checking satellite photographs. It could, against videos, checking accents, checking registration plates, checking signs within videos. All the techniques that are really the fundamentals of journalism, which are the who, what, when, where, why, and how, but simply applying them in a much more sophisticated way against new types of information. And I think it's increasingly a challenge for newsrooms generally, and it's something that I think as time goes on, it will be, you know, at what point next year will it be 1 billion tweets? And how will you filter and get out the signal from the noise and all that information? And I think for where journalism is going, it's a really important challenge, because there's really, really important stuff being shared online. And just like any traditional news organization, we're very focused on getting to the nub of the matter, getting the right content, and contextualizing. And then we will share that information with our clients. And we also try to work as closely as we can with people on the ground. So one of our core operating principles is that there's always somebody closer to the story, because there's usually somebody somewhere, in an awful lot of countries, not in all countries, where if an event happens, somebody will witness it, somebody might tweet it, somebody might take a photograph, somebody might take a video, and they might want to get that video out and get seen by as many people as possible. So, I mean, these are, as news shifts and changes going through this period of disruption, which is the digitization of information. And I think as it goes on, the amount of information how it is filtered and managed is going to be a critical skill and a critical technology for journalism in the future.
Thank you very much indeed, Gavin. Our fourth speaker is Afef Abroughi. Afef is a journalist, a blogger in Tunisia. She was editor of Tunisia Live. She is a contributor to Global Voices and a regional editor at Index on Censorship for a practitioner's perspective.
Thanks. In my intervention, I'll talk about two points. First, I think that internet would not have been the space it is today without social networks, and social networks have transformed internet into this inclusive, open, and free public space where anyone can share and anyone can have access to information. And the interactive nature of social networks, which rely on user-generated content, is making it harder for autocratic regimes and governments around the world to censor. And this was something that I noticed from my country and from the uprising that took place in Tunisia. The former regime of Ben Ali spent enormous resources on net censorship, and this had earned Tunisia the Reporters Without Borders Internet Freedom Enemy title. And despite the huge resources spent on internet censorship, and despite that many social networks and many websites were blocked during the uprising, information, the flow of information around the internet did take place, and information managed to reach large audiences in both Tunisia and outside Tunisia. And this is again because netizens and activists are becoming more aware about how to protect themselves, for instance, using Tor or and netizens will always find a way to overcome censorship because there are smart tools out there like Tor, for instance, to protect themselves and to protect their privacy. And they can use proxies to have access to blocked websites. And if a regime blocks access to a Facebook page that is criticizing it, then a second version will emerge, and many other versions will emerge. And if we take a look at Syria now, we are all aware that there is a lot of net censorship there and oppression, but still we still get to still videos and images of the conflict there still reach our computer screens. And this is again how these social networks are making it hard for regimes to censor. And the last point is, I guess the only way to censor, the only way for governments to censor now is to shut down internet completely, and this is what happened in Egypt with the Mubarak regime. But that desperate act drew a lot of international pressure, a lot of international criticism, and of attention on Egypt, and then the regime, and then the internet was accessible again in Egypt.
Thank you very much indeed. Our fifth speaker is Gary Davis, who is Deputy Data Protection Commissioner here in Ireland.
Thank you. It's very happy to be invited along here today, and in fact, in many respects, my comments mirror those which Ian made earlier, perhaps maybe applied to Ireland and how we see the world. In terms of the internet, your information and your personal data is in fact the oil that lubricates the engine that is the internet economy. In that way, therefore, data protection authorities, which perhaps up till recently existed in reasonably dusty back offices dealing with old records, have come to the forefront in a way that even we have found relatively unexpected, as we've emerged as the chief regulators for how those companies who are at the forefront of the internet use your information. We're also the chief regulators in relation to how the government and governments around the world seek to access your information as you go about the internet every day. And I suppose what we're seeing is that right now there's a bit of an imbalance in terms of what all of you understand as you go about the internet every day as to what's actually happening. And some of this speaks to privacy policies, some of it speaks to people not really understanding what the implications are of what they're doing. So is the role of a data protection authority to better educate people? Is that a choice for the person? Or do we have to step in actually to mirror what Ian was saying earlier, to actually regulate in a space where we have to work from the basis of thinking that perhaps people don't understand what's best for them and we'll try and tell them what's best for them, which is of course a slightly dangerous space to be in. That's of course not to say that the internet companies themselves have been acting in any way improperly in terms of how they've been collecting and using information. In fact, their very innovation in terms of providing the services for free with you as the essential product of the service is what's brought us all here today and has allowed us all to enjoy the internet experience free of charge. But it does come at a cost, and that cost is your information. I suppose maybe a good example to my mind of where people don't really understand what's happening as they go on the internet is this cookie debate that's going on right now as a result of an EU law. Now that law was introduced because the legislature clearly came to the view that people coming to the internet and using particular services on basically every website did not understand the types of tracking that was possible of them as they went around their business every day. So they introduced a law, potentially a slightly imperfect law in that it's slightly irksome for people to have to be clicking yes, no along the way, but probably a slight improvement on the situation that existed up till then, which is that people were giving no information and didn't realize that as they went from one website to the other, to another over a period of days and weeks and months, that in fact they were being tracked. Of course, we would have heard in response to that, well, actually people can go and delete their cookies. But I'm sure if I did a quick show of hands in this room, I wouldn't see a huge amount of hands going up for people who've actually in the last couple of weeks gone into their browser and flushed their cookies. So in fact, that's an example of where a law was introduced because people plainly weren't going to do it. So the law is in fact catching up in this space. Another example of where that's happening is the draft EU regulation on data protection, which was introduced by the European Commission in January of this year, which is intended again to redress what is seen as a slight imbalance in the relationship at present. The view being that companies and governments even are offering services without, I suppose, properly building in privacy from the bottom. So one basic principle of that new law is what's known as privacy by design or privacy from the bottom up, which means that as companies roll out products, they actually have to think about privacy as they do it, and that will be a legal requirement. One of the more vexed issues in this new regulation is this famous right to be forgotten, which potentially has come a little bit too much to the forefront in debate, but it is there. And that is a sense, and maybe it comes out from the 400 million tweets that Gavin was talking about, that information once put out on the internet exists forever. And it's very hard to put it back in the box. So European Commission has come up with an idea that in fact you can put it back in the box. Now, I have my doubts about it, but I understand why they're doing it. And maybe an example that we dealt with in our office might help to illustrate where it might have application and where it won't. 25 years ago, a well-intentioned care worker in a care home in Ireland sent a letter to the local newspaper, a letter to Santa for one of the inhabitants or one of the children who were in the care home. all the best intentions so that the child could read the letter, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, in the local paper. It was published and the child read it. 25 years later, the child had become an adult and had moved on with their lives. The local newspaper digitized its archive, as newspapers are increasingly doing. And in digitizing their archive, the letter to Santa that was written by the well-intentioned care worker then started appearing as the #1 result on Google whenever you entered her name, because it was a unique name. She went to the newspaper actually said, go away, we value our archive more than anything else. Not an unreasonable position for a newspaper to hold. And we eventually became involved and brokered an outcome whereby that individual page could be taken down. That's a completely unintended consequence when 25 years ago the care worker wrote the letter to Santa. But for that person, she did not wish to be defined 25 years later by the letter to Santa, which indicated she'd been in a care home. It wasn't something she wore on her badge every day. That's what I think the European Commission had in their mind when they brought in that type of rule. I don't think they had in mind the other extreme, which is people convicted of murder or whatever else it might be can come to authorities such as ourselves and say, listen, I've served my sentence, I want all references to that removed from the internet. I think that's an unreasonable position. But there is probably some examples in between which are reasonable, and that's the sort of thing which perhaps is achievable. But beyond that, I think trying to put the 1 billion a day, if we get to that, tweets back in the box for those people who maybe regret tweeting something a particular day might be slightly unachievable.
Thank you, Gary. That gives a new meaning to the term "the right to be forgotten" by Santa and by everybody else. And Richard Allen, head of policy at Facebook for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And obviously, Richard, you're bound to be asked issues around data protection and privacy. But I was wondering if you could sum up in this first part of the discussion some of the big picture questions surrounding social media, social networking, in terms of the power relationship, in terms of the emancipatory nature or otherwise of it. Over to you.
Thanks, John. And I would like to talk about how we see the tool that we've built, and that other people built tools similar to ours, I think, feel the same way about theirs. And then perhaps we can dig into some of the detailed challenges, which I'm sure there'll be around how that tool is created and how it's used in the question and answer session. At one level, what we've done, we think, is very simple. We've created a tool that allows people to connect with each other and share stuff. And that's what social media essentially does. It says, here's a way to make connections with other people and share stuff that's of interest to you and potentially to them. And in doing so, what we've done is to create multi-purpose tools. And the range of uses of these multi-purpose tools is largely determined by the community that adopts them and not by the platform itself. And these tools, we should be really clear, they can be used for both good and bad purposes. And we're still very much learning all the time about both of those, both the good that people will make use of with our tool and also the ways in which they will take the tool and abuse it in our terms in order to achieve negative outcomes. And it's really good to be here today because it's at meetings like this that we learn about both frequently. The platform itself, as I say, is not an actor. It doesn't create revolutions or cause political action to take place. But people do sometimes use these tools in interesting and incredibly useful ways, as Afef has reminded us. It no more creates a revolution than a spade digs a hole without somebody to pick the spade up and actually take the action of digging that hole. But clearly, in the same way that a spade is a potential hole, social media is a potential tool for creating all forms of political and civil action, as well as a whole range of other potential benefits. We fundamentally believe that our tool is there for good. That's what gets us up in the morning and makes us go to work. And we see those goods actually largely in the context of economic, social and cultural rights. It's people advancing their day-to-day economic, social and cultural rights by staying in touch with family and friends in a way they couldn't do before, by engaging in economic activity on the platform, which we certainly don't see as incompatible with a human rights agenda. It's very much part of it being able to plug into a global market, and their cultural rights to access and share a media that are of interest to them. So that's what people are doing on a daily basis. And again, to put it in context, for most people, most of the time in most countries, it is only the benign effects that they feel. It's not a crisis across social media in terms of what's happening. But at the same time, as being optimists, we are realistic that there are situations, specific geographical situations and specific communities of people who can experience real challenges. And that's why we have in place infrastructure. Sonia Flynn, who's here for Facebook, runs a very large international headquarters operation here in Dublin with several hundred people in it. And a lot of those people are dedicated precisely to dealing with the challenges that do come up. And I'd say those challenges are really in 3 areas: privacy, identity, and security. In terms of privacy, we do follow the transparency approach that Ian outlined, but I think I agree with Ian that it's not sufficient. The other part of transparency is accountability. So being very transparent so people are not surprised about your privacy model. And ours, we say on the front page of the site, it's for sharing things with people. So clearly that's what the service is designed for, but we don't want them to be surprised by how that sharing takes place. But also we do need to be accountable, and that's why we're accountable to the Irish Data Protection Commission, to the Federal Trade Commission, to the United States, and indeed directly to the people who use our service. There's a real accountability loop there. In terms of identity, again, it's very important that we're upfront about that. Identity on Facebook is a core part of that privacy model. If you're inviting people to share personal information, they want to have a reasonable degree of certainty that the people they're sharing with are who they say they are. And that's why we have our real identity policy. It's not to annoy people or to make life difficult or to create threat, but it's because it's essential to a model where you're inviting people to share personal information. I'm sure we'll discuss that further in Q&A. And then lastly, on security, again, it's just a baseline that we have to keep our service secure from unauthorized access. I'll just throw, whoever those unauthorized actors are, those are people who have no legitimate reason to access the data in our service. But just throw one thought out in closing. I was at a meeting in the Middle East and North Africa region recently, and we were discussing precisely this issue and what should be the legal regime for granting authorized access, the kind of issues that Ian was talking about. The consensus in the group I was sitting with was, whatever is written in the law, the government will access all of our data anyway. So we want to behave online as though that's happening. So our response is not to seek legal change, but our response is to behave as though we're being constantly supervised. I personally found that quite depressing, but I'd be very interested in the context of this discussion as to whether or not there's a consensus here that that's the inevitable outcome.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard. Thank you to all our speakers for very thought-provoking introductory remarks and for keeping very much to time. It's given rise to various thoughts and questions from the chair, and I just wanted to raise these and ask panelists for their various thoughts. Afif, when you were giving a largely optimistic perspective, particularly from Tunisia, and one can understand why, given the changes that took place there, and more broadly, albeit incomplete and patchy, more broadly in the region, in the Arab Spring. But do you fundamentally see social media as a tool for breaking hierarchies, for challenging power? Or was it simply that the power structures were rather slow initially to understand them, and that they have caught up with great skill, and that whether it is 50 centers in China, whether it is trolling through state-encouraged tweeters or people on Facebook, where do you see the situation now? Do you remain so optimistic in a broader perspective?
Well, it's true that in my introduction I painted this maybe optimistic view of social networks and the use of social networks. But in Tunisia now, social networks are used for bad reasons too. So they are used, for instance, to spread rumors, to spread lies, to defame people, especially now that the political scene is open. So we have like many political parties and people with different political affiliations that are defaming each other. And the challenge, especially for Tunisia, a country which suffered a lot from censorship. And the debate now in Tunisia is whether we should have red lines or internet legislation or internet legislation, because we do not have much internet-related laws. So this issue is raising the concerns of many free speech advocates in Tunisia, because especially with the trauma of the past, people are afraid that if we censor a Facebook page, for instance, for spreading rumors, then that will be used as an excuse to censor other Facebook pages or even other content. We have, for instance, this debate whether we should, whether pornography should be censored online. And again, people are against it because free speech advocates in Tunisia are against it because they think that if we start by pornography, then we will move to other content, and it will be used as an excuse. So for me personally, I don't think that censorship is the solution, because I believe that every technology, mobile phones or any other technology, can be used for bad or good reasons. The challenge is to raise awareness of internet users instead of resorting to censorship. Let's, for instance, teach parents how to use parental control to protect their children from pornography instead of resorting to censorship. Let's for instance, raise the awareness of young internet users in Tunisia, and especially on Facebook, how to verify information instead of reacting immediately, on how to use, to resort to trusted websites and sources. So this is the debate.
And the point that Gavin was making about the information explosion around the world. Now, obviously, in a country where information is much more closely guarded and switched off from time to time, as was the case in Tunisia, that is then suddenly removed. And as with so many other countries, you now have an information explosion. And you were talking about people finding it very hard to separate rumor from fact, motives, malign, benign. How are people navigating that? And what are the tools or activities that people are embarking upon in a practical sense to help navigate this area?
I think this explosion of information that you mentioned is quite natural after 50 years of, more than 50 years of dictatorship, and after years of internet censorship. And Tunisia is known to be one of, used to be one of internet freedom enemies, according to Reporters Without Borders. And I know that internationally there isn't like much attention paid to Tunisia, but Tunisia was, when it comes to internet, like Iran or China. So this explosion of information is quite natural, even though we have these tendencies to spread rumors. I think in Tunisia we are all in the process of learning. Internet users are learning how to verify information for themselves. For instance, sometimes there is a tweet about something happening, a rumor, or maybe it's a true information, and someone would respond, "What is your source?" So this is the tendency of Tunisian internet users that are becoming more aware themselves about how to verify information and to back down before maybe reacting or doing anything else.
Thank you. Gavin, you were talking about the YouTube human rights channel. But what about the phenomenon of people using social media predominantly to be social, predominantly simply not to engage? And you could take the other argument and actually say that social media, except in particular situations, such as Tunisia, such as Egypt, elsewhere, is actually quite a good method of anesthetic. It is actually quite a good method for people to converse in a perpetual way without actually engaging in the tough issues of state.
I think what we see every day in work, and we would monitor an awful lot of tweets and lists and YouTube uploads and monitor the activity of lots of people, is that we're focused mainly on events that generate information. So, for example, there was a helicopter crash in Kenya recently where a minister was killed, and some Kenyan journalists were tweeting an image of the supposed helicopter being passed around on Twitter. And I was tweeting the guy directly saying that's not the helicopter because I had done a reverse image search to find out that that's not what's going on. I think what I often see within social networks, particularly when it comes to Facebook pages related to Syria, is while there is a video is posted to a Facebook page, and there will be discussion about the credibility of that video, there'll be discussion about, so it does lead to action, it leads to reaction. It's not just people talking about things, it actually leads to people engaging. And when you're trying to monitor hundreds of Facebook pages and you're trying to monitor thousands and tens of thousands of Twitter accounts, you often actually see very interesting conversations discussing all sorts of issues. And I see your point when it comes to, well, does that lead to actual action? And often it does. To me, a Facebook post itself is an action. Somebody taking a video is an action that previously wouldn't have existed.
But, Brigitte, what do you think? What is the percentage of and obviously I'll ask Richard this, what is the percentage, do you think, of Facebook pages or anything else in Russia, Contact here, or any of the purely the social media pages that are actually political or galvanizing, and how much of it is just simply people talking among themselves, which is actually great for governments?
I don't know how it is in other countries than Iceland. I can really only relay information from there because actually Facebook has been used in a very political, as a very political tool for change. And we actually had the first Facebook revolution in Iceland in 2008 because the origins of the pot and pan, well, actually I participated in the first protest after the banking crisis, and that was organized by some guy on Facebook. And it was quite big. And then the idea of the pot and pans revolution originated. Somebody posted on Facebook group, hey, let's all bring our pots down to outside the parliament. And then that came sort of the symbol for our soft revolution. And we have, like, I think 97% of adult Icelanders are on Facebook. And there is a huge part of it is simply political discussions about what is happening in Iceland. And we are really trying to use, I'm a special advocate for more direct democracy and for people to take more responsibilities in their societies and to be more part of decision making. Like, I'm always calling out to my voters and Icelanders, please watch what I'm doing. You know, it's your responsibility to know what I'm up to and keep me on track on doing the work that you hired me to do for you. So in Iceland, we have actually used it, I think, differently than in many other countries because we are such a small community. It has actually been a very useful tool for many changes in our country. And of course, there are people there that are just talking about what sort of dinner they're cooking and stuff like that. But it's a healthy mix, I think.
Richard, I mean, Facebook arose out of a frat club in a university, and university students talking about who they liked and who they didn't like, and whatever else. Have we seriously moved on?
Yeah, I think in many ways it's a reflection of real life, and these analogies of the town square I think are quite accurate. Most of the time in the town square, people are engaged in social, cultural, economic activities. That's what they do every day. But at special times when things are happening, the focus of attention in that town square then switches to whatever the latest crisis is. And I think that's precisely what we saw in Iceland. I have to say, actually, for Gary's benefit, one of the most interesting calls I had was from the Irish data protection officer, from the Icelandic data protection officer, who rang me up and said, there's a fake account on Facebook of this person, you need to remove it. And I said, how do we know it's really that person? They said, in Iceland there's only one person with that name and they're sitting in front of me. So there was a kind of very strong verification of Icelandic Facebook users, which actually I think also helps in terms of the political efficacy, that it is real people really organizing. And a lot of what is taking place, John, I think you don't actually see, because it is that private messaging. It's, when a demonstration is happening, it's people in their private messaging system saying to each other, are you going on the demo? And when you see that 20 or 30 of your real friends are going to the same demo, that actually has a huge political efficacy that, simply signing a sort of random petition or something in a more public space often doesn't have the same effect.
Ian, you were co-author of this GNI report on the human rights challenges online and in terms of social media posed by governments citing security and anti-terrorism, you came out with a series of recommendations both to governments and to companies, and Facebook has now joined as an observer, and Google, Yahoo and Microsoft are already involved, and European companies are very strongly being invited, and from further afield, to become involved. Would you just outline, with reference to this discussion, what those main recommendations are?
I can't remember them like that, I'm afraid, John, but I could say broadly that, first of all, a lot of what we recommended drawing on these international law frameworks, GNI is already an exemplar of in the GNI principles that have been developed by the GNI members, the companies that you mentioned, the human rights groups, the academic experts over the last 5 or 6 years. So actually doing things which these companies already do, and Facebook certainly does, I know, talking to Richard, thinking when they go into new markets where human rights protection might not be as strong as some of the OSCE member states, planning what kind of services they're rolling out, how they're designed, where they will keep personal data, for example, under which conditions might that data become available, understanding the legal systems and the practical experiences that companies have had with those governments. So one of the things we suggested was that actually companies better share that information, because they're doing very detailed jobs themselves right now before they take that step, and we thought by sharing it with each other, and ideally online for everybody, that will make it much clearer to other companies what kind of human rights challenges they might face going into specific new markets.
One question we haven't yet addressed, and it will, I'm sure, come up in the Q&A, is the question of anonymity. Gary, maybe from your perspective, and maybe we'll just go around the line quickly, do participants across all social media have an inviolable right to anonymity?
No, I think is the short answer. It depends on the flavour of service that one is looking for. I think Richard has outlined earlier Facebook's policy in relation to a real name culture. It's one which we have examined and heard the reasons from Facebook as to why it wants a real name culture, for a whole host of reasons, and we don't feel that it's up to the lawmakers to impose upon a commercial offering that it must have a anonymous flavour, as it was, of its service. I do think, however, that a right for people to go about the internet generally without having to identify themselves every step of the way is important for people, is important for people in terms of feeling confident as they use that service. And I think a point which perhaps is not that well understood by governments and is coming out from the contributions being made is that if governments increasingly push the envelope in terms of requiring those internet companies that I have a relationship with to provide my information at various times in response to various incidents that the government has stipulated, well then I'm going to stop using those services, and I'm going to withdraw from using those services and perhaps use them in a different way, which in fact will undermine the very democratization that we're talking about. And I think that's an important point for this panel to reflect upon, because often there isn't a voice for that other angle. What we hear is the security agenda, and the security agenda is obviously important to governments, and I don't wish to in any way be seen to minimize it, but the way in which it is being pushed pretty much relentlessly in terms of people's use of the internet, I think is wrong. And thus far there hasn't been the voice for proportionality in terms of how that's done. And while I don't wish to comment on UK legislation, certainly I would worry if similar legislation as the Communications Bill was being introduced here in Ireland in terms of what it would mean for Irish people when they make their decision to join services and use the internet. And is that what we really want? Do we want to discourage people from using this tool which has brought us here today and which has allowed people to communicate with each other in this way?
But just to clarify, you're saying it's up to each company to determine the rights or otherwise to anonymity according to each service?
People are taking a decision. So, you know, one of our lead newspapers in Ireland, the Irish Times, has a policy of allowing people to comment anonymously. It's been open to criticism for doing so. I fully support their decision to do that. That's a decision they've made, commercially examining the situation. Should we make them have people identify themselves and posting comments? No, I don't think we should. I think that's inappropriate. But equally, should we make other companies who've made a decision that if somebody wants to participate in their service that they have to do it on a real name basis, should we make them allow for anonymous participation? No, I don't think we should do that either.
So, Gavin, on the verification question then, how does anonymity play out?
Well, I think when it comes to, when you're talking about how to test the veracity of content, especially when it comes to digital content, anonymity isn't always, anonymity is very important in journalism generally. Sometimes in order to test the veracity of a video, for example, from Syria, it's not always necessary to have direct contact with the person. Sometimes it's good. But techniques that are often used in Syria over the last 12 months include holding up newspapers at the start of videos and saying today's date is, and then filming a vista or a panorama of where they are to say this is where I am. And that's helping people like us, you know, understand that. So in a way, sometimes anonymity is a critical part of journalism, but I think there's other ways that things can be done.
Brigitte?
Yeah, well, that's it's a very complex question with a very complex answers, and I think that in many ways I agree with the previous comments, but it is much, much bigger than most people are aware of. I have become sort of a guinea pig on privacy issues online as in the status of an MP. I have been just lost a case through 3 different court systems in the United States where the US government has found ways to legally hack into my backend information, my private information, not the tweets, but my personal messages and my IP numbers and so forth. And there are 3 other companies that have been requested to hand over my personal information. And I don't really care about my personal information, but I care about the information that my voters and people that confide in me and trust in me, because they don't understand that they should only communicate through governmental official emails. And that would probably be the only platform that is protected. So I have to rely on that, you know, companies such as Facebook and Google are watching my back, which they can't always do. And what
has been their response to these legal requirements from the US authorities?
Well, Twitter, actually, the only reason I know that the government was trying to get into my personal data was because Twitter took them to court to unseal a document that said that the government was requesting them or demanding that they hand over my personal stuff within 3 days without my knowledge. Now, I don't know, and my lawyers and I have excellent lawyers from the EFF and the ACLU in the States. We have not been able to get the information out officially which other 3 or 4 companies handed over this information. That's a secret.
Can you shed any light on that, Richard?
No, and I know, like I have talked with my lawyers, and they say that, you know, Facebook and Google do try to do stuff, but the legal framework in the United States is just so bad, and I have a very serious concern about this for regular people. I am a member of parliament, you know, so thus, you know, I probably have a much more high-profile case than ordinary citizens.
And what is the legal justification through these court hearings, briefly, that they cite for justifying their actions?
Basically that the government can have what they want, you know, when it comes to our privacy. And that's why I think it is. I'm very pleased that they went after you can actually find all the information about my case on the EFF.org website. But basically, there is a law that does not protect me because I'm not a US citizen. And yet, the headline was when I lost in the final court, we decided not to take it all the way so that we wouldn't set a really bad example for everybody else. Basically, we have all become Americans now, but not in a good way. But we're still not protected by their good amendments,
constitutional protection.
Protections. So I think it is actually very important that we realize that it is so easy to go into all our digital data and harvest it and mine it for information. That should not really be in the hands of anybody except yourself, and you should know that the governments are going through your data, digital data. And so everything about us in our modern days is actually in a digital format. All our transactions, every time we go to the shop, it is recorded. Our medical history is online in some form. And every communications we have, virtually every communication is somewhere in a format that government can actually harvest it. And so I think it is extremely important, since we have many lawmakers here, is that we have stronger laws for privacy online than offline, because it is so much easier to gather it. If the FBI would have knocked on my door and said, hey, we are going to go through all your papers and all your letters and stuff, that would have created a very big uproar both in Iceland and the international community. But because it's so virtual and it doesn't feel real, then they get away with it. And they get away with it with, so many more people than most of us are aware of. How many requests does Google get and Facebook every day from governments? And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Of course, the telecom companies hand out this information very freely, and that's an issue that's not been discussed very much here, at this conference. People just unfortunately need to make themselves aware of that everything they do online or in a digital format can become tomorrow's headlines.
Richard.
I think those principles we talked about earlier of transparency and accountability are important here, equally applied to governments. I think most people would accept that governments need to track down people who are committing serious crime and so on, and they do sometimes have a requirement to collect data for that. But equally, most people would be very uncomfortable if they thought the government was capturing data in a routine and wholesale way just because it was curious and snooping. People would have very different views about that. But we can't really make that judgment unless we know what they're doing. And for me, it's actually it's still an obscure area. I know Google, and I'd praise them for it, have done a very good job publishing, if you like, their end of the transaction. And obviously, we and other internet companies are looking at the same thing. Should we publish our end of the transaction when government makes a request? But I think whatever we do, that's much less satisfactory than government doing it. Governments should be prepared to say to their citizens, in order to keep you safe, this is the kind of snooping that we do on your behalf. And they should be prepared to justify that and engage in a debate. And then if citizens feel uncomfortable, they can lobby for the law to be more expansive or more restrictive. But I think a lot of the time we're sort of grasping in the dark, because this whole thing is cloaked with a national security banner that means we don't even know, what's going on in our own names. And then it's difficult to achieve the goal, which I think we all want to get to, which is there's a great British tradition of policing by consent. And I think it is that consent-based security regime that is the one that all countries should be aiming for.
And Ian, it's not just the question of the number of takedown requests or requirements for information about individuals. It's also the manner of those requirements. And I thought one of the interesting developments outlined last night at Google's Big Tent and its latest transparency report was dividing up those demands between court orders and non-court orders. So talk us through a little bit around that. The sort of word in someone's ear is quite different to the semi or fully transparent court order.
That's right. So both things, again, that we recommended in our GNI report. One, much greater transparency, as Richard was saying, the kind of thing that Google does, strongly recommended for other companies, either individually or collectively, but also equally government doing that. Most governments have some form of transparency. So the US government, for example, does publish statistics on the number of wiretaps, but all the action is going on in the data around that, around who's talking to who, for example. Being clear about the purposes for which this data is shared is important. As Richard was saying, I don't think you could find anyone that would say governments should not be allowed to do some of this stuff if they're trying to stop a murder happening, very serious crime, stopping acts of terrorism, and so on. But if we, the citizens, don't have any idea, what exactly are those 500,000 requests in the UK a year for communications data being used for? I would imagine not all of them. We don't have such a high rate of murder in the UK, fortunately. We need to know more. I think Google, again, commendable in doing what they've done, trying to give more information about the purpose of the requests, whether they come from a court, an independent judiciary. I mean, it should go without saying, is a key component of the rule of law, that you have judges making these decisions where possible, and not politicians, because there's always the temptation, no matter how well-intentioned politicians are, they have many pressures on them, and sometimes they might just not have time to give consideration that they should to surveillance that a court can.
Before I ask Afef for a final word, just to say, do we have the microphones ready for questions? We'll just take questions in 1 second. We'll have time for a tranche of 20, 25 minutes of questions, then we'll break, and then we'll have a period for extended questions following on from that. Afef, finally, the question, going back to the question of anonymity, where do you stand on this when it came to exercising your, when it came to the Arab Spring, when it came to what was going on in Tunisia?
Personally, I do understand those who want to use Facebook or Twitter or any other social networking site in an anonymous way, because I mean, especially like under autocratic regimes, it is quite. I quite understand why these people want to protect themselves, and I think they have the right to do so while they are simply, I mean, exercising their right to freedom of expression and freedom of speech. So and at the same time, I do understand that some companies like Facebook have some concerns, or do not allow some people to register on Facebook in an anonymous way. So I think I hope that Facebook and other companies will take into considerations maybe to remove some restrictions when it comes to anonymity for those who are for activists and those who are living under autocratic regimes. I don't know how you are going to do it, but this is my hope, at least.
Just to respond to that, I mean, we've looked at it and we keep looking at it, and we want to be as helpful as possible in the cause of allowing people to use our platform. The challenge we've had is we've found no way to apply it so that the good guys can benefit and the bad guys can't. So we found it, I use those terms loosely, but we found that the simplest and most straightforward thing is to say to everyone, there is one rule. And the rule is, on our platform, you must identify yourself. If you wish to talk in a different way, then there are other platforms available. And that's the challenge. But as I say, it's not something, it does keep us awake at nights, trying to kind of get to this point that we want to get to.
Right, time for questions. We've got a couple of microphones on either side. Right, there, lady in the blue, first up, and then one from this side. Or another one there, right at the back. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Catherine Fitzpatrick, and I understand we've had a lot of calls for accountability to governments, and specifically, the U.S. was invoked in this last round. But I think this has been completely devoid of context, so I wanted to know how you could support WikiLeaks, which is why you were being investigated. And what about the privacy of all the sources of the people who were mentioned in WikiLeaks, many of whom were endangered? I've personally worked on cases of officials who've been hounded and harassed and forced to leave their countries. What about the whole question of, do you have the right to expose the cables of a democratic liberal state? And you want to create a safe haven in Iceland for data, but it's used to mount attacks on a democratic country.
Okay. Could you say where you're from?
I'm from New York, from the U.S.
No, but are you attached to an organization or?
Yes, Jacob Blaustein Institute.
Thank you. Brigitte, WikiLeaks and also the broader question of safe haven to mount attacks on governments.
Well, first of all, I helped co-produce Collateral Murder. I don't know if many of you have seen this video, but it shows soldiers committing war crimes and killing a wounded man and the people trying to help him, which is, you know, an obvious breach on the Geneva Convention. So I would help co-produce similar videos like that 10 times over if I would be asked to do it. I was a spokesperson for WikiLeaks for Collateral Murder because I helped co-produce it and put a lot of work into also verifying the content of it, the people that were in it. We sent off journalists to Iraq to find the children that were in the van and the other people. And sadly to say, nobody's been held accountable for that video except the person that's allegedly has...
Can you answer the lady's broader point?
Yeah, and I just want to make, because he is asking me about the cables. I'm not responsible for the cables because I was not a part of WikiLeaks when they released the cables. So
well, you may not have been directly responsible, but I think she's entitled to a view from you about what you thought of the cables.
Well, I thought that actually particularly the way WikiLeaks was working on releasing the cables in association with 100 different news organizations around the world and doing it exceptionally slowly was a very responsible way to do it. They were definitely trying to make sure that people that were vulnerable within the cables would not be jeopardized their identities. However, there was an unfortunate event where The Guardian actually published the password in their book inside WikiLeaks as the name of one of the chapters in the book, and people within WikiLeaks I heard, I can't verify it, I wasn't there, were worried that various agencies had figured out that this was the password to a file that was on Pirate Bay. So I think it was originally somebody that had actually left WikiLeaks that notified, and thus the cables came into circulation.
But when we're coming to talk about rights to privacy, rights to all kinds of different rights, as the lady points out, what about the right to confidentiality? If you're a government official or a company official and you write an email to somebody else, do you not have that right for that email not to be put out in the public domain?
Absolutely.
So how do you reconcile that with WikiLeaks?
I think these were not emails. These were reports from the embassies in various countries. So there were reports from officials. Like in Iceland, the person that was writing the report was a CIA official within the ministry because we didn't have an ambassador for a while. Perhaps what the publishing of the cables and publishing in particularly of the Afghan and Iraq war logs was to verify what had been circulating as gossip because people couldn't get it verified about a lot of very serious events, such as the Iraqi body count, who had counted many more civilians being killed than was official numbers. So I think within all of this information was tremendously important validation for people that have been trying to have their voices heard about war crimes and corruption. And I think perhaps and the only advice that I have been able to sort of present in this regard is that we should really learn from this, all governments, that instead of having secrecy by default about so many things that should really be in the public domain, we should reverse it and have everything transparent by default, and a discussion about what needs to be secret and what not, and consensus about that. Instead of always, we can learn from the cables, we can learn from the Afghan and Iraq war logs and the files from Guantanamo Bay, and try to make our governments more honest. Of course, I'm deeply sorry if there have been people hurt because of the cables, but there have been many more people hurt and killed today in all these various wars and corruption in our world. So maybe we should at least look into ways to keep our governments more accountable and to make sure the information that should remain in the public domain remains in the public domain and accessible. So that's my only answer that I can give to you.
Let me just go around the panel a little bit on this. Afef, where do you stand on this? Were there sources or people mentioned in Tunisia and in the region that you suspect to have been compromised as a result?
Yeah, I mean, WikiLeaks indeed did mention some. There were like information released about the situation in Tunisia, and there were many people who were saying part, of the reasons behind the uprising in Tunisia was the information released by WikiLeaks. The information involved, corruption from the regime, but the information was already there. Before even WikiLeaks, and it did have an impact. I remember people were, because the thing is, in Tunisia we have our second language is French and not English, and one of the innovative ways to help Tunisians to have access to this information was made by Nawit.org, is a collective blog, and the website created the TuniLeaks, Tuni from Tunisia, and the leaks, and it translated the information released by WikiLeaks in French and Arabic. And just to add one thing, for me, I don't have like a lot of information about WikiLeaks, but I remember one thing that has personally touched me was the video that Brigida was talking about. I think it was a journalist who was being shot. So that's the only one of the things that remain in my mind about WikiLeaks. That video.
Richard, what's the Facebook view? What's your view?
Honestly, I take collective responsibility for what we do at Facebook. I don't get into the detail of what another service is doing. I don't think it would be appropriate for me to comment.
So you have no view on WikiLeaks?
No.
Okay, well, clear enough. Right, at the back.
Not as Facebook.
Hi, my name's Andrew from Frontline Defenders. I have a question which is, I guess, about Facebook, but maybe applies also to other social media providers and maybe also email providers. I have a friend in Syria who has a Facebook page. It's not obvious from her Facebook page what her real name is. If the Syrian government makes a legal request to you for her identity details, will you give them it? And maybe more broadly, for all social media providers or email providers, is it good enough to accept that having a legal request from a repressive government is enough to give up information that can lead to somebody being tortured?
Great. Let's go on the direct question to you first, Richard.
So, just an informational point that may be useful for people working in these areas, that there are two ways in which you can represent yourself on Facebook. One is through a personal profile, and the other is through what we call a page. The profile has to be presented in your own identity according to our rules. The page doesn't. It can represent an organization or an entity that has its own representation. And the two are not necessarily connected. So one piece of advice for anyone who wants to work and present themselves on Facebook, but not to use their real identity, is to use the page, which is quite legitimate and appropriate for them to do. That piece aside, the substantive point of your question was around requests for data. We actually publish on our website the guidance that is offered to law enforcement agencies. And that tells them that the default method for requesting data from Facebook is to go through what's called the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty. So in this case, the government of Syria would have to apply to the US Department of Justice for that data. And that would act as the filtering mechanism, if you like, the application of the standards that are applied in the US courts in order to determine whether or not that data can be given. To complete the picture, there are some exceptions to this, and those exceptions are typically either in a threat to life situation where the disclosure of the data may prevent a death or some kind of serious harm occurring, or where we have an established relationship with the law enforcement agencies in that country. Neither of those conditions, as far as I'm aware, would apply to the situation you've described in Syria, so the Syrian government would have to ask the US government for that data, and you can imagine for yourself the response that they would get.
The second point, which is it good enough simply for a request to go through legal channels? I was wondering, maybe Ian and Gary might have thoughts on that.
So what we recommended in our report is actually, as Richard was saying, that mutual legal assistance treaty route should be the default, because that's the way that states can work out the human rights protections that should apply and other consideration of the rights of all those affected before data is handed over. It's actually, I think, quite unfair for governments to put pressure on companies to hand over data, including perhaps the more or less explicit threat that otherwise the company can no longer do business in that regime. Companies aren't courts of law, in many ways, for many good reasons, and companies are not in the best position to make those. Sometimes, your Syria example is probably quite an easy one, but there are more difficult examples, and companies are not best placed to do that. Courts, and when it comes to state issues of public policy, states are in a better position to do that. That MLAT route right now can take a very long time, which can make it completely unsuitable for urgent criminal investigations. So I think, again, we recommended that was something that states and intergovernmental organizations should look carefully at to see whether they can really streamline and speed up that process while still protecting the rights of all those affected.
Gary.
I think mutual legal assistance treaties are the way to go in terms of responding to requests. I think there are situations where service providers are faced with urgent requests to protect the life of potentially the person involved, and I think in those situations it's relatively straightforward for them to provide the data. It is something we have looked at in our audit of Facebook, and we do not see data being passed out, or we didn't see in our initial analysis data being passed out in any way that one might term haphazard. There is a very high bar before data is handed out other than outside mutual legal assistance rules.
Let's take one or two more questions, then we'll break for coffee, and then we'll come back. There'll be a lot of time for more questions. There towards the back, and then here towards the front, and then we will have those answers, and then we'll take a break.
I'd like to ask Mr. Allen...
Could you identify?
Colm Kenny, Professor of Communications at Dublin City University. I'm not sure I can imagine what the US State Department would tell the Syrian government. I think it might depend on the day of the week and what the strategic interests of the United States were, but I'm more concerned about what Facebook are telling the United States authorities. You've compared Facebook. You said the analogy of a town square is pretty accurate. Not to me it isn't. I mean, a town square is publicly owned. Facebook is owned by a lot of very rich people who are trying to maximize profit. And I think I heard you say, but I hope I'm wrong and you'll correct me, that you're struggling with the issue of should we publish our end of the transaction when when the US requires the handover of information? I'd like to ask you, if I heard you correctly, what do you think most of your customers, most of your users in the town square believe is the answer to that question? It's pretty simple, I think. I think most of your users think you should tell them if you're handing over information on them to US authorities. But perhaps I misheard the question, and you'll correct me, please. Or I misheard your earlier comment, and so the question is irrelevant. But if the question is relevant, what's your view? Do most of your users think that you should be handing over information to the US authorities and not telling them?
Thank you.
So I think the verb I used was looking at rather than struggling for that one. When we're talking about the transparency report, we're actually not just talking about the US government. We're talking about, if we look at what Google has done as a model, we're looking at publishing the information about the number of requests you've received from every government around the world. And I think that is a really interesting and good exercise that Google has done. When we say we're looking at it, the reason is you need to consider the implications of doing that in terms of whether the data is truly representative, whether you have data sets that are sufficiently mature and robust enough to put out for public scrutiny. So that's the work that I say. I don't think Facebook is unique, but most companies in our space have looked at what Google has done and said, you know, can we collect the same kind of data and publish it in a robust and meaningful way? That's different from notifying individual people about requests that have been made in respect of their data. That typically is not a matter of choice. And there are exceptional cases, and Birgitte's described some of the process that can take place. But our experience is that the regular form of request that one gets, whether it's from the US government or any other government, is covered by an anti-tipping off provision in law. And so you're typically not able to tell people, even if you wanted to. So there is a debate about, in those exceptional cases, when you can tell people, should you? And again, you know, we've become observers of the Global Network Initiative. We're part of a family of companies that are looking at these issues and adopting best practice, which does say things like, if you can tell people, you should. But I wouldn't want to mislead you into thinking that was the normal situation. Even if you tip off when you can, the vast majority of data requests that any internet company gets, we would be prosecuted if we told the subject of those requests. So we have no discretion.
Do you want, just give it, take the microphone. And briefly, please.
The question was, do you think most of your users think you should tell them?
Yeah, and then again, just come back to the point I was trying to make earlier, which is, you know, the law is the law, as it stands in the United States or anywhere else. If the community of internet users or the community of citizens generally believes that tipping off should be the norm, then they have a democratic channel to make sure that the relevant legislation is amended. And that really is the way. As long as the legislation in force says we can't tip off, you know, we know our place as a commercial entity that's governed by law. We can't just sort of choose to ignore that piece of the law. If people are feeling very strongly about it in the United Kingdom, I suspect they will feel very strongly about the legislation that's just been published there, then the correct channel is to make sure that piece of legislation includes things like tipping off provisions, transparency provisions, adequate supervision, judicial supervision. But that has to be in the law. It's not something that Facebook can determine.
Let Birgitte and then let Gary come in.
Okay, so because from what I understand is because of the US laws, it doesn't matter what laws are passed in the UK. If the US government wants to access information that has even a sister company in the United States, they can.
Just because the UK wants it as well. So it doesn't affect the US situation, but it would create another regime and another government that is seeking to access data in a new way.
But are we not entering an era of sort of a transnational legal free-for-all with governments seeking, so if it's the British government and it wishes to see email traffic between someone in Pakistan and somewhere in France, they'll make sure they get it.
Mm-hmm. So most legislation in this area says we protect to a certain degree the rights of our own citizens, and we're going to define the conditions under which we can security trumps privacy. Most of this legislation says if you're not in my country, we don't care. I mean, you have no rights. I mean, that's the typical model. That's the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act in the UK. It's the normal model for surveillance legislation. So yes, and I mean, the challenge we have at the moment, frankly, is that governments are kind of tripping over themselves to gather more and more powers. And some of those are going to run into conflict. We will have, you know, data in one country where we're told legally we can't disclose it, and we'll have a government in another country saying legally we must disclose it. And that's the area we're sort of running into at the moment.
Gary, and then Ian, you were nodding. Do you want to come in? Yeah, Gary.
Yeah, thank you. I attend many fora like this, and there's an unfortunate, I think, focus on US government powers in this area. And my experience is we should look to our own in Europe. We have laws in Europe which are equally as invasive in terms of people's privacy. So certainly the focus on the US, while maybe in certain cases deserved, I think it's a worldwide issue. In terms of the tipping off type point, it comes up, of course, frequently from a data protection perspective. We have to grapple with it constantly. I would agree with Richard. Supervision might be a more appropriate model. I think it might be slightly naive to suggest that if the police are seeking to investigate a person who's engaged in kidnapping or child abduction, that the model is to suggest that, and now I'm taking an extreme and not to be difficult, but that the model is to tip off the person prior to them actually being able to prevent that crime from continuing. So there's balances in the model, and clearly it would be impractical to expect a person to be told where it will actually impair an investigation. That's not for me to say. Law enforcement will make that point end over. Now, of course, the point is, can it be taken to extremes? And yes, of course, it can be taken to extremes, and blunt instruments such as never telling the citizen are not correct, but equally a model which says that citizens should always be told ignores the reality of certain investigations which police authorities validly take. And I think it's important to get the balance there.
Yeah, and the point about Europe is surely an important one. A couple of quick observations. At the Google Transparency report last night, I stand corrected if wrong, but one of the largest spikes in requirements for takedowns and for information came from Spain, which seemed to me to be interesting. And a point that Brigitte mentioned, which hasn't been addressed properly, is the telecom companies in Europe, who work very, very closely with governments, providing them with information pretty much, minute by minute.
Yes, and just for the very practical reason that most of them were run by the state until just a decade or two ago, and they still have very close links with the state. But to follow up on Gary's point as well, certainly it's the case that the US is not the only country with these laws. Let me just add, though, more specifically about Europe, at least the members of the Council of Europe have the European Convention on Human Rights, which includes protection for all people under the control of those states, whereas, as Brigitte was saying earlier, one of the big problems with the US regime is some of the protections actually only apply to US citizens on long-term residence, and combined with the fact that so many huge internet companies have all of their data stored in the US does make this an issue, and I think it's something that intergovernmental organizations need to look at moving forward. I understand, but it's impossible to know because it's a classified document, that the UK, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand intelligence cooperation agreement does say that the intelligence agencies of those countries should not spy on each other's citizens, particularly as a route to get around prohibitions on domestic surveillance. And I think actually that's a good model that perhaps should be extended further across other European states and states under the rule of law with effective human rights protection.
There was a guy here. Yeah, would you mind terribly postponing until the first question after coffee? Just don't move your seat. I mean, you can, yeah, as long as you go back to the same seat. And then we'll have a whole series of questions after there and then there, and we'll have best part of an hour for questions and summing us up. If we could reconvene, please, at 4 o'clock. Thank you.